Hi, Misha here, and last year, a video I was really excited to do, and I'm hoping maybe it'll be one of those videos that gets a lot of traction going forward, was on the Finnish L-35 Lahti pistol. I was able to show 3 different versions or variants, 3 different series, which I thought was pretty cool and unique because only about 9,000 of these were ever built, and there are not that many in the USA. But in that video, I also promised I would address the more common and still very interesting and cool Swedish M40 made by Husqvarna. And while over 82,000 of these were produced, at least 50,000 were actually melted down. So only 20 or 30,000 survive in the world today, too, not making it a very common gun. These are unique guns to kind of Scandinavia and built for the cold. So in this video, I want to talk about the history, how this is not really a direct clone or copy of the Finnish version, and talk about some variants and things like magazines, holsters, what have you. Yeah, it's going to be one of those nitty-gritty videos, but maybe going forward in the future, this can help someone if they're looking to buy one, or just if they're sick in bed and need something to help them sleep. We'll see how it goes. But with that, yeah, let's talk about what happened in Sweden before the M40. Here are the nation's preceding military service, primarily Army, service guns. The M87, the M07, and the M39. Now this video is not going to go too deep into these because it's on the Lahti, but context is king. The M87 here was really one of the first modern, well-ish guns that Sweden adopted. It is a Nagant, and it's actually a variant of the 1893 Nagant with influences from Switzerland's 1892 revolver. Namely, it fires the same 7.5 ordnance round. Unlike the Russian Nagant revolver you may be more familiar with, it does not have a cylinder that cams forward, more traditional, but it is still double single action. The first run of these were made in Belgium to Swedish specifications, and then between around 1897 and 1904 and 1905, another run was done in Sweden by Husqvarna under license. They had about 15 to 17,000 all told of these. By the interwar and World War II period, this was an obsolete gun and had mostly been retired to second-line use, police use, railway, and of all things, postal use, but still officers carried them because it was a reliable gun and it worked well in the Arctic. Speaking of, the M07 or 1907 here. This was Sweden's first automatic, self-loading service handgun. Already by 1904, they knew they needed something that was becoming the trend, and so they trialed out several guns. They were interested in John Browning's 1900, 1903 designs, but they were also very interested in the German Luger. And in many ways, they thought the Luger was a better gun, but the Browning style was a little more economical, easier to produce with their technology of the day, and it proved itself to be more adept at handling the deep freeze winters in Sweden, so they ended up going with it. It fires 9x20 semi-rimmed, which for that day and time was actually considered quite a potent cartridge. This is still a blowback gun based on the FN model of 1903. The first of these were made by FN, again in Belgium, and then production would begin in Sweden during World War I, at Husqvarna. And again, it's very standard. They did give it an improved extractor and an enlarged and stronger safety for use in the cold and also with winter gloves. Interestingly, production would not end with these until around 1941 or even 1942, as Husqvarna was assembling what they had left as far as the parts. And they would build nearly 90,000 of these. And this was the standard gun. And it looked like it would be the standard gun for quite a long time, because in the 1920s, the Swedish government was convinced that war was over, that World War I, the Great War, had kind of cemented that. Sweden was already trying to remain neutral, so funding for military hardware was already quite low, and sidearms, handguns, always tend to take a back seat to other things anyway. So that's why the 1907 soldiered on in both production and use probably longer than it should have. Again, not a bad gun when it was adopted a decade before the Great War, but by the 1930s, yeah, not exactly the most common thing. Plus, this newfangled thing called the submachine gun was coming around. And that gets us to the M39, which is the Swedish Army designation for the German Walther Here's pistol, HP, which was the commercial export name of what will become the P38. Now, in the beginning, Sweden looked at different submachine guns. They ended up going with Lahti's KP31, what we know as the Suomi, and they first tried chambering it for the 9x20 cartridge, but this was not ideal. It was a semi-rimmed round. It didn't work great. They needed something with a more modern round, hence 9x19 parabellum. So the idea, adopt one cartridge to use in submachine guns and pistols. So we need a new pistol, and we can just update the Suomi, which is being produced by Husqvarna under license, this becoming the M37-39. And they really liked what Walther was cooking with the HP, soon to be the P38. This was a very modern pistol. Double single action, 9mm, standard magazines, modern construction, decocker safety. So they ordered initially 1,000 pistols, which were delivered prior to the onset of war in September of that year. This is why they have a lot of early features, including the early style sights, the early style checkered grips with the round lanyard hole and lanyard, the early style safety decocker, the early style firing pin, yada yada. Well, as you might imagine, after war was kicked off, and since the German Bundeswehr, and this is the German the German army, had just adopted it as a P-38, they didn't have production capacity left over. Sweden did look into making these themselves. They couldn't. They didn't have the tooling, the know-how, the machinery. Obviously, they could have purchased it, but that would have been exorbitantly expensive and time-consuming. Again, this was a very cutting-edge pistol using stamped components and new machining techniques for that damn time. It just wasn't practical for Sweden to produce this, even if Germany had been willing. A second batch would come over of about 500 around 1940, bringing a total of 1,500 M39s into Sweden. This second batch would be less like this and more like a standard early P-38. They would continue to use these, but 1,500 guns was just not enough. And thus, we enter the Lahti. The Swedish military was quite happy with their new 9x19 cartridge. They just needed a pistol, at least more than this, to fire it. Well, beginning in December of 1939, they encountered this one in the hands of their allies. Sweden was officially neutral when Russia invaded and kicked off the Winter War. But they did have about 8,000 Swedish volunteers, independently, privately, we swear, go and help fight with their Finnish neighbors and allies. And there they saw this newfangled pistol that the Finns were just starting to get a few hundred of during the Winter War. This would be very similar to what they saw early on with the rounded chamber indicator, stock lug on the back, and a holster essentially modified from a Luger pattern. And so in 1940, once the war was over, the idea was, what about this Lahti pistol? They already had good experience with the Lahti submachine gun. So they asked Finland, can you build us some? And Finland said no. They could barely build enough for themselves. But we'll give you a license to build these yourself. And unlike the M39, HP, P38, the Lahti required more traditional manufacturing techniques. Stampings weren't really a concern, machined parts, more square. Plus, it had the benefit of being designed to work in the cold, something, of course, Sweden was equally concerned about. So it seemed like a good fit. Just one problem: who to build it in Sweden? Carl Gustaf, the official state factory, was busy with its own projects, including the heavy machine gun, 1936. It was doing some work on some Mausers. Of course, later it would be doing the AG-42. Yeah, it had commitments. And the Husqvarna factory was probably even more loaded down, doing the new M37-39 Suomi submachine gun. Also still building some M07 pistols. And they had taken over the new military bolt action, the M38, from Carl Gustaf quite recently, doing a fresh run of those. Well, there was a small factory in the south of Sweden, really had no gun manufacturing experience, but they really thought they could do it. And so the contract was initially given in relatively early 1940 to a company known as Rosenford Bruck. And if you've never heard of them, that's okay, because, well, they had no experience. They did not have really adequate machinery. They did not have workers used to producing guns, therefore the quality control standards, and they had a hard time getting adequate steel. They would make some initial run frames for the Lahti. The military inspected them and said, no way. And so they went back to Husqvarna and said, are you sure you can't do these, maybe, please? And by this time, they had kind of cleared off a few projects, and with government encouragement, the contract was canceled with Rosenford, and a new one was issued to Husqvarna. And that's how we get their version of the Lahti up here, which would be adopted in Sweden as the M40. Also the M40S in Denmark. Now it's worth saying that while no new M39s would come in, they would continue to use these. They're perfectly good guns, even refurbishing them and rebluing them in typical Swedish fashion. You know how they like to keep their guns in tip-top shape. But the M40, they could build them. They had the know-how, and so they geared up, and in very short order had some pre-production guns ready to show the Army. The first 80 or so pistols made by Husqvarna were essentially identical to the, at that time, current either Series 1 or Series 2 Finnish L-35. But very quickly, they would make changes. Now, I will say that in this first year, they would do another 100 to 150 pre-production models with full-scale production commencing by 1941. And once they did that, they made one straight solid run up through 1946, give or take. And they produced over 82,000, maybe even 84,000. It gets a little murky because sometimes serials repeat with different things. But let's talk about changes and then the variants. Very early on, the first thing they decided they did not like was this here loaded chamber indicator. I'm not sure why, but they did not like it. In fact, of the 80 guns made with it, 78 were promptly recalled. It was removed, the spot machined off, and welded over. Now, most of these guns don't survive to this day, but yeah. So even the second series of pre-production would not have the loaded chamber indicator. I don't know, again, I don't really know why they hated it so much, but, one can guess. Maybe it was because it put a weak spot in the slide. Maybe they didn't like how it obscured the sights, cluttering up. Maybe it made changing barrels more difficult. If it was only a cost thing, I don't think they would have done a recall. They just would have not put it on for, future guns. The basic specs of the pistol were the same. Weight, length, 4.7 barrel. But in the details, we would have a number of changes. Where to begin? Well, yeah, since we got rid of the loaded chamber indicator, we have a pretty smooth top, but they did add serrations, or small grooves here, to cut down on glare. And another early change was to the recoil spring. With the finished version in the back, it's free-floating. It comes right out when you disassemble it. Very soon with the Swedish version, they went to a captive spring. Another early change, they altered the trigger guard. The steel here is not thin, but not terribly thick, and the hole is normal size for a normal finger. But Sweden wanted larger hole for use with winter gloves, and they went to a much thicker, heavier guard. One can understand why. This also might have been a little bit faster to machine. The barrel, too, received a number of changes. Here we have the finished one with this nicely tapered angle here, and we have a nice ramp for the front sight with serrations. Very attractive. Also, the serrations make for less glare, and the barrel has a bit of a smooth taper as we get to the muzzle end. With the Swedish gun, the barrel itself has less taper and is a little thicker at the end, so it's a slightly heavier barrel. The front sight, the first Swedish guns did have the steps, the serrations, but very soon they went to just a simple fixed block. But most importantly, they added wrench flats to the end of the barrel where it screws in. And this was to make barrel changes faster and easier on the unit armor level. Because just as the Swedes were doing with their Mausers, they really did not want guns in service with eroded bores. In fact, they would check these, putting 1 to 3 small little symbols, kind of triangular symbols, to denote barrel erosion. And just as with Mausers, if it got to a 3, it would get replaced. And then usually they'd stamp a crown in it. Like the finished gun, it had a blued finish. Very similar polymer grips. But of course they would have Swedish stampings instead of finished ones. They also went to a larger lanyard loop in the back compared to the Swedish. And they would make some changes to the magazines we'll get into detail in a bit with. Early on, these grips were black, but since resources were limited during the war period, even with Sweden being nominally neutral, they would quickly go to kind of a brownish reddish. The same thing would happen in Germany with the P-38 and their other grips. It's just between the polymer and the lack of dyes. So you'll see both colors. And another thing, knowing that they had a limited supply of steel, they intentionally used lower grade steel for the frame and slide with molybdenum in it, reserving the high quality steel with nickel in it for the barrel, primarily reserving that high quality steel for other guns like the heavy machine guns and the Suomi machine guns and the Mausers. You do what you gotta do. To that end, they made a change in this area here, which they always kind of felt to be a weak point, and to their credit, they were right. Originally, with the finished design, there's more of a taper and a step here, and there is one large hole for the bolt accelerator that was added to have the gun work well in the cold. We talked about it in the original L-35 video. The M40 retained it, but they reinforced the slide in this area. You can see this bulge here. And they went from one large hole to kind of 3 smaller holes to try to prevent cracking. So they were aware from the beginning that they were using less than desirable steel. But, you know, needs must and all that, guys. Needs must. And all of these changes happened quite early on, still during the war. The gun, while it's known as M40 for 1940, actually wasn't officially adopted by the Swedish Army until 1942, and started to get into units in 1943 and 44. So wasn't really completely being phased in until 1945, 46, and all of that. Of course, Sweden, being Sweden, it didn't see any active combat in their hands. I should point out about the serial numbers. No prefix means that it was from Swedish Army, at least Swedish Army contract. F prefix meant it was for the Swedish Air Force. H prefix actually meant it was for civilian commercial sales, and there were some of these. And the D was for Denmark. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So we do have a few prefixes and things. And even though it was one big long run, there were a few different contracts. Although the style, like barrel length and everything, none of that changed. Funny thing, this was often nicknamed the Iron Range because Husqvarna also made stoves, iron stoves. And this is a heavy gun. Solid machined steel gun. Single action only. Yeah. For more on the details, you can check out my initial L-35 video. Let's talk mags for a minute. Here we have the finished mag. These were produced in the white. They have a checkered button for loading. Kind of a Luger style follower. Notice the large lip in the back there. Most Swedish mags were blued. Number of reasons for this. They did do a few in the white, but those were only shipped with commercial guns. And early on, they were very much a copy of the finish, with that large bumper lip in the back. They had a checkered button, although the checkering seems slightly less aggressive. Something about the finished mag feels a little sturdier, but that could just be subjective. But they would go to a late pattern mag here with a few noteworthy changes. For one, the button is now smooth, no longer checkered. They also altered the shape of this spot down here at the end of the track. Still has just a smooth side here. And another noteworthy changes with this in the back. This went to a much thinner one. In fact, it went from about 4.5 millimeters to under 1.5 millimeters. So that was a pretty big change. More of a stamped component. So there are at least 3 major variants of Swedish mags. And of course they're all interchangeable, and you'll see this throughout. So let's talk holsters. This is a Finnish one. It's a modification of a Luger pattern. Has the loading tool up here in the top. Quite a large, long cleaning rod here. And it has stowage for 1 spare magazine here. The Swedish guns were set up a little differently. Here's one of the holsters. A little smaller, lighter, and also carried more. We have 2 spare magazines instead of just 1. And we have a smaller cleaning rod. And we have a loading tool slash takedown tool, a little screwdriver there. These are used to help load the magazines. And there would be several colors. There would be dark brown, light brown. They would make these from cow, pig skin. There would be black versions, and there would be a pebble grain version. Now this is not a Lahti holster. This is for that M07 pistol. But kind of shows you. This also holds 2 spare mags. So, several types of holster, all the same basic pattern, just different colors and materials. As far as I know, they never did a canvas one, but I could be wrong. But I do know they did stow some of these in the forest, in little forest caches. So they'd put them in essentially environmentally proofed magazines with lots of preservative, storing them with the gun, a total of 3 mags, an oiler, a solvent bottle. They were in a separate bag. And then the cleaning rod and holster. Kind of neat. I think that does partially explain why the magazines are blued. Probably a little better environmental protection than just left in the white, even if the white, I'm sure, was treated to some extent. And of course these 2 had the spot for a shoulder stock. But much as in Finland, that was not a common piece of gear. Oh, one other thing. Lanyards. Should have pulled this out before starting, but oh well. You'll forgive me, right? Here is the late style lanyard. Rope. Earlier, it could either be flat or round leather. But as you can imagine, cold leather. Going to more of a cotton treated rope. It just made sense. Also explains why, with this thicker rope, having the larger loop in the back. Yeah, made perfect sense. So with that, let's talk about service, the infamous cracking problem, and the Danish contract guns that have the D on them, and why those seem to be the common ones you see in America today. While the vast majority, 60,000 or more, would go to the Swedish Army, with a smaller number going to the Air Force and elsewhere, there were other batches. For example, quite early on, 41, 42, 200 were sold to the Swedish Railways System, which was a private company at the time. These were actually taken from Army stocks. Also, at the end of production, either late 46 or 47, either 850 or 950 were assembled with the commercial H prefix using existing leftover parts and sold either abroad or commercially within Sweden. So there were some small batches here and there for the civilian market. But as far as other users, Norway and Denmark are 2 of note. Beginning in 1943, Sweden started training and aiding resistance fighters from both nations. Norway, they would set up what they called them region police units, and these would begin acting in 1944 against the Nazis. And they would be gifted about 500 M40s, and serials seem to be in the 31 to 32,000 range from the standard Army production number. That kind of tells you where they're at in production about this time too. Not quite halfway through. Around the same time, they were training up Danish freedom fighters, Danish resistance fighters, and they would be gifted about 1,000 as kind of personal sidearms, and they would take these home. And the Danish government, first in exile, later back at home, would order around 2,000 more, give or take. And the numbers get a little foggy here when you add them all up. But what we do know, after the war, they would order at least 10,000 more from a special contract run for their police. And that's where the D comes in. Those were specially marked guns. They're the ones that were officially known as M40S in Danish service. They were for the police. And serials would range from about 5,000 up to about 16,000, give or take. It's said that 13,500 were sold to Denmark. I don't think that counts the 1,000 that were initially gifted. Hard to say, though, because, again, if you add up all the numbers, you get a number well over 15, even over 16,000. Yeah, take it as you will. Somewhere between 13 and 16,000 were used by Denmark, and again, used by their police. And that's actually how we end up with them in the country. These are the ones that were imported here because the Swedish Army ones were melted down. Here is my other finish, L-35, and notice it has a smooth top slide with no chamber indicator. This was a replacement slide. Several of these were done by Valmet, as well as a couple of other subcontractors, to replace cracked slides. And in both instances, the slides were cracking due to hotter machine gun ammo being fired through them. This ammo was really meant for the Suomi, and in Sweden it was known as M39B ammo to designate it from the standard M39 9mm ammo. Now, it wasn't like these were just blowing up after 2 rounds. Swedish testing, once they realized there was an issue, revealed that on average a gun would make it around 3,000 rounds before developing critical cracks. So it was a known issue. In fact, replacement slides started to be made by Husqvarna around 1960. They were thicker, they were reinforced in this area, and some were said to be lacking the bolt accelerator. Here is the finish gun. Hopefully I can get it on camera for you. Maybe, maybe not, but it's right in there. The accelerator. All of the Swedish guns I personally handled still have it. And a friend actually has a late production one of these with the serial and the 15,000s. And it still has it as well. By the way, some of the last Danish contract guns would be marked RPLT. Kind of neat. So if you have a marking on your gun, it tells you it's a late one. But of course it still has the reinforced area here, the bulge on the slide that even the late fin slides did not have. Although they did eliminate some of the scalloping and stuff, so it is a little bit heavier. But that was the cause. It wasn't ideal, but to be fair, using this metal with the molybdenum in it, they knew they were making sacrifices, but it was wartime and Sweden didn't know. Germany was invading everyone, so they could have been next. So by the 1960s, with that long gone, 2 decades out of the fact, it's just one of those things. It still remained the standard issue gun within the Swedish Army, even into the 80s, even when the cracking issue became enough of a concern that they actually started pulling out some old M07 pistols and putting them into rotation until the replacement could come along. But, you know, it was an issue, but like a lot of issues, these were not made out of Play-Doh. And if you fired them with standard 9mm, they did not have near as many troubles. And that's actually why the Danish contract guns here are so nice, because these were police guns. A, they were loaded with regular 9mm, and B, they were fired comparatively little. For a full takedown and all that, you can check out my L-35 video. Very pleasant guns. Perfectly good trigger on these too. Actually, probably feels better than it has any right to. But yeah, both would stay in service in their respective nations for about the same length of time, even with production being long over. I don't think Norway ended up with more than the initial 500, but I could be wrong on that. But of course, its days were numbered, because in January of 1991, the cracking issue came to a head. Literally, one of them let go during training and hit a trooper. And that's why the Swedish government ordered that the 50,000 or so that were still in the inventory be melted down. Dear. It was time to replace it anyway. This was very much early World War II technology. Single stack. Could not obviously handle hot ammo. Single action. Heavy. Big. But it kept in service for the better part of half a century, so I don't want to unfairly malign it. And it allowed Sweden to produce its own gun, whereas most of the other options available to it at the time would have required either buying a whole lot new machinery, retraining workers, or relying on a foreign power, and no one really had production capacity left over in 1940 to help Sweden out. Anyway, its replacement was already being trialed out. So really the accident during the training in January 91 was the final straw. They would use the 07s until the next pistol was ready, and you know it, it was a Glock, or rather two Glocks, known as the M88 or PIST 88 or P88 in Sweden. That would be the full size 17, and the M88B or PIST 88B would be the compact 19, and these would begin to see service in the early 90s and still serve the Swedish Army, Air Force, and police to this day. But they really did get their money's worth out of this, I must say. Also, a small other sad fact, Husqvarna stopped making military firearms in the 1970s. Of course, in America, most people know them because of chainsaws, which is fair. But actually, the company started off making guns way back in the 17th century. So they were not a Johnny-come-lately, not like the Rosenford company. But I just wanted to give this a really thorough breakdown. The Swedish guns are still relatively common in America and usually in really good condition. But of course, you always hear about the cracking issue. And you do need to examine the gun here. And if you own one, definitely don't be firing a 9mm plus P. Maybe not even 9mm NATO. Maybe stick to like old school 9mm Parabellum. But they are, generally speaking, safe to shoot. But I would say during cleaning, examine for any cracking, because you do not want to be beamed in the head by this slide assembly. It is extremely heavy and old school milled steel. Just because the molybdenum made it a little soft for gun purposes, or rather a little too brittle, that doesn't mean it feels any different when hitting your noggin. And if you haven't and would like to, check out my previous video on the L-35. Again, I'm trying to go in depth on these because there's just not much out there on the Lahti, and I've always found this gun fascinating. It's its own unique design, and Emo Lahti was a very interesting individual. And if you'd like to know more about Glocks, hell, check out any of 100 or 1,000 other channels because, while I'll talk about them, they're not my specialty. Anyway, I appreciate you hanging out today. If you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to the Patreon page. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.